Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor said this week that some public servants are overpaid. Given the Prime Minister has had to administer a slapdown to her squabbling cabinet, does she think the Chancellor was actually talking about her own ministers?
Can I first of all join the Right Honourable Gentleman, not only in praising the work of our emergency services, but also in recognising the way in which, after the terrible terrorist attacks we've seen, and of course the Grenfell Tower fire, that appalling tragedy, the way in which we have seen communities come together and support those who have been victims of those terrible incidents that have taken place. And I was very pleased to see Nose to be able to visit Finsbury Park after the attack that took place there and see for myself the work that had been done in that community and the work that he had done over that night in working among his constituents to ensure that the community came together after that terrible attack. Now, in terms of public sector pay, I will simply say this to the Right Honourable Gentleman. I recognise, as I said when I stood on the steps of Downing Street a year ago, that there are some people in our country who are just about managing. They find life a struggle. That actually covers people who are working in the public sector and some people who are working in the private sector. And that's why it's important that the government is taking steps, for example, to help those on lowest incomes through the national living wage. It's why we have taken millions of people out of paying income tax altogether. It's why basic rate taxpayers under this government have seen a tax cut of the equivalent of £1,000. But you only get that with a strong economy, and you only get that with a Conservative government.
Corbyn! Thank the Prime Minister for what she said about my own community, and I'm obliged to her for that. However, my question was about whether the Chancellor had said public service workers are overpaid or not. The reality in this country, Mr. Speaker, is simply this. A nurse on a median salary starts on £23,000. Police officers, £22,800. Job centre clerks on £15,000. I had a letter from Sarah who wrote to me this week about her sister-in-law, who is a nurse. And I quote, "She has sacrificed her health for the caring of others. She's had a pay freeze for the last 5 years. Only her dedication and passion for her vocation keeps her going. Why is this happening?" What does the Prime Minister say to Sarah and those others working in our NHS?
I'm saying to the Right Honourable Gentleman, what I say to Sarah and to those working in the National Health Service is that we recognise the excellent work that they're doing. We recognise the sacrifice that they and others have made over the last 7 years. That sacrifice has been made because we had to deal with the biggest deficit in our peacetime history left by a Labour government. And as we look at public sector pay, we do balance being fair to public sector workers, protecting jobs, and being fair to those who pay for them. And the Right Honourable Gentleman seems to think that it's possible to go around promising people more money and promise that nobody is ever going to have to pay for it. He and I do both value public sector workers. We both value our public sector services. The difference is, on this side of the House, we know you have to pay for them.
The Prime Minister doesn't seem to have any problem finding money to pay for the DUP's support. Her government has been in office. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have been in office for 84 months. 52 of those months have seen a real fall in wages and income in our country. And in the last Prime Minister's question time before the general election, the same Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Every vote for me is a vote for a strong economy with the benefits felt by everyone across the country." Does the Prime Minister agree you cannot have a strong economy when 6 million people are earning less than the living wage?
I'll tell the right honourable gentleman when you can't have a strong economy. It's when you adopt Labour Party policies of £500 billion extra borrowing, which will mean more spending, more borrowing, higher prices, higher taxes and fewer jobs. The Labour government crashed the economy. The Conservative government has come in. More people in work, more people in jobs, more investment.
Jeremy Corbyn! Can I invite the Prime Minister to take a check with reality on this? Mr. Speaker, 1 in 8 workers in the United Kingdom, that is 3.8 million people in work, are now living in poverty. 55% of people in poverty are in working households. The Prime Minister's lack of touch with reality goes like this. Low pay in Britain is holding people back at a time of rising housing costs, rising food prices and rising transport costs. It threatens people's living standards, and rising consumer debt and falling savings threatens our economic stability. Why doesn't the Prime Minister understand that low pay is a threat to an already weakening economy?
The best route out of poverty is through work. And what we now see is hundreds...
Order. The question has been asked. The Prime Minister's answer must, and however long it takes, it will be heard. The Prime Minister.
The best route out of poverty is through work. That's why it's so important that over the last 7 years we have seen 3 million more jobs being created in our economy. It's why we now see so many thousands of people in households with work rather than in workless households. Many more, hundreds of thousands more children being brought up in a household where there is work rather than a failure to have work. That's what's important. But what's important for government as well is to ensure that we do provide support to people. That's why we created the National Living Wage. That was the biggest pay increase for people on lowest incomes ever. When did the Labour Party ever introduce the National Living Wage? Never. That was a Conservative government and a Conservative record.
Mr. Speaker, it was Labour that first introduced the minimum wage with opposition from the Conservative Party. Mr. Speaker, wages are lower than they were 10 years ago, and the Prime Minister has been in office for just 1 year, and during that time disposable income has fallen by 2%. The economic consequences of austerity are very clear, and so are the social consequences. Life expectancy stalling for the first time in 100 years. Today, the IFS forecasts that income inequality is going to get worse and that child poverty will rise to 5 million by 2022. Does the Prime Minister...
Order! Members are shouting, and shouting excessively. They must calm themselves, take some sort of soothing medicament. Jeremy Corbyn.
I'll try and help the Honourable Member, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister not realise that her talk of a strong economy doesn't remotely match the reality that millions of people face with low wages and poverty at home?
The right honourable gentleman is, of course, wrong in some of the facts that he's putting forward. In fact, inequality is down, life expectancy is continuing to rise. But what we know in terms of a strong economy is that what will not deliver a strong economy for this country is Labour's policies of more borrowing, more spending, higher taxes and fewer jobs. And what the right honourable gentleman wants is a country that is living beyond its means. That means making future generations pay for his mistakes. That's Labour's way, and the Conservatives will never do that.
Mr. Speaker, what we want is a country where there are not 4 million children living in poverty, where homelessness does not rise every year. And I look along that front bench opposite, Mr. Speaker, and I see a cabinet bickering and backbiting while the economy gets weaker and people are pushed further into debt. Well, you could
for Stratford-upon-Avon is gesticulating in a distinctly eccentric manner, and he must stop doing so. Shakespeare's county deserves better. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is wages are falling, the economy is slowing, the construction sector in recession, trade deficit widening, and we face crucial Brexit negotiations. Isn't the truth that this divided government is unable to give this country the leadership it so desperately needs now to deal with these issues?
I'll tell the right honourable gentleman the reality. The reality is that he is always talking Britain down. And let's look at the record of the Conservatives in government. 3 million more jobs, 4 million people out of paying income tax altogether, over 30 million people with a cut in their income tax, record levels of people in employment, record numbers of women in work, deficit cut by 3/4, inequality down, record levels of foreign direct investment. That's a record to be proud of, and you only get it with a Conservative government.